Hello, and welcome to the virtual companion series for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, A History by Dr. Dennis C. Dickerson. This video covers Chapter 5, Into the Second Century, Migration, Depression, and War, 1916 to 1945. I am Dr. Christina Dickerson-Cousin, and I will be providing historical context to guide your understanding of Chapter 5. The topics that I will discuss include World War I, the Great Migration, Garveyism, the Great Depression and the New Deal, and World War II. In June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie were visiting Sarajevo, Bosnia. Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb, assassinated both of them. He was hoping that this would help lead to the end of Austria-Hungary's rule in the region. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. And because of a previously established alliance, Germany supported Austria-Hungary. Russia, on the other hand, supported Serbia. Great Britain and France entered the conflict on Russia and Serbia's side. This all leads to what is now known as World War I, which lasted from 1914 until 1918. Initially, the United States was not a part of the war, but finally entered in 1917, and entered on the side of the Allied forces. For African Americans, the advent of World War I was a complicated issue. On the one hand, African Americans had always been very patriotic. They had served in numerous wars before World War I. But they also were conflicted. Do we support this nation that is our own? Or do we accept that maybe we have no obligation to fight for this nation that discriminates against us? W.E.B. Du Bois said that blacks should, quote, forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy. Some agreed with him and some did not. Ultimately, over 2 million black men registered for the draft, and over 300,000 black men served, though only 42,000 saw combat, and they served in segregated units. Black soldiers received inferior combat training, so their training camps oftentimes did not have adequate facilities or equipment. For example, sometimes they had to practice with shovels rather than real guns because, again, these supplies and equipment were inadequate. Most black soldiers were relegated to support units. So rather than fighting on the front lines, they were loading and unloading supplies, digging trenches, and burying the dead. But for those black soldiers who did see combat, they acted with great valor and great courage. The Harlem Hellfighters were a notable example. They served alongside the French at the front for 6 months, and the French army awarded the entire regiment a high military honor. When black soldiers returned home for the war, their families and friends were enormously proud of them. They had gone abroad. They had had all kinds of new experiences. They had been exposed to different cultures. They had seen combat. And so they came home and their families and friends gave them a hero's welcome. White supremacists, on the other hand, were alarmed to see black men in uniform, and they were alarmed to know that these African Americans now had military experience. They knew how to use weapons, and they knew how to defend themselves. These white supremacists were determined to put black veterans in their place. Reflecting these attitudes and sentiments, you see anti-Black violence occurring throughout the tail end of the war. So from 1917 to 1919, you saw a steady increase in lynchings. The summer of 1919 was particularly dangerous. James Weldon Johnson, who was the field secretary for the NAACP, dubbed it Red Summer. That summer, there were race riots in 25 cities, including Chicago, Charleston, Omaha, Knoxville, and Washington, D.C. Claude McKay wrote a powerful poem talking about Red Summer, reacting to the violence, and the fact that African American men, after having these experiences in World War I, simply were not going to accept this treatment from white supremacists. They were going to fight back. You see this in the final two lines of this poem. Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall dying, but fighting back. The outbreak of World War I had another impact on African Americans. So in addition to Black men going off and serving in the war, you also have a tremendous impact at home. Because of the war, new employment opportunities became available in the North. Blacks moved to the North in large numbers, initiating what is known as the Great Migration. And this Great Migration lasted from 1916 until 1970. During the Great Migration, millions of Black people moved north, and this caused a demographic shift both in the North and in the South. In 1910, 90% of African Americans lived in the South, and you can see that by 1940, 30 years later, 77% of Blacks lived in the South. Blacks left the South. They participated in the Great Migration for a variety of reasons. Of course, to escape the poverty, they had been in large numbers in the sharecropping system, for which they had, very little escape. They were making very low wages. So they want to escape poverty and seek better job opportunities in the North. And they also hope to escape the violence of the lynchings and the indignities of the Jim Crow system. Because of World War I, fewer European immigrants came to the United States. And as a result, Northern industries needed to fill those positions that had been filled by European immigrants. So they sent agents to recruit Black workers from the South. And they, gave them a big pitch. They said that jobs in the North will pay $5 a day. And for Black men who were making as little as 75 cents a day in the South, this was an enticing offer. Typically, Black men moved to the North first. They would take up their jobs, get settled, and in the meantime, they would send letters home describing their new lives. Oftentimes, these letters would be filled with exciting anecdotes about the big city, what they'd seen, what they'd heard, and all the opportunities that were available. Sometimes they would even go back home to the South, visit their family and friends, and have new cars and new clothes, and this would just get others excited about moving up to the North. So after getting settled in the North, Black men would then usually send for their family and friends. One branch of my family participated in the Great Migration. Some of my relatives from South Carolina migrated in the 1920s to Western Pennsylvania. So this is very much a part of my own family story. Not all Black people were excited about this Great Migration. If you are a Black business owner in the South, you are not excited to see your customers leaving en masse. If you are a Black church, you might be fearful that all your members are leaving. So there was a difficult side to this. For those left behind in the South, this migration meant a lot of change for them as well. Part of how they tried to dissuade blacks from going to the North was that they would say, as tough as things are in the South, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. We know what's going on in the South. We know what to expect. You don't know what you're going to face in the North. You're going to move to the city where it's crowded and dirty. They have race riots up there too. There's racism in the North as well. But despite these warnings, black migrants were undeterred, and they filled train stations year after year, heading to northern cities. Once they arrived in the North, black migrants had to rebuild their households, get used to new jobs, register their children for school. Black churches like Quinn Chapel in Chicago helped to guide these migrants through this transition. And as a result, church membership in northern cities swelled. So whereas black churches in the South are losing members, northern churches are gaining members. So we've looked at World War I and the Great Migration. Something else going on at this same time was the rise of Garveyism. The rise of Garveyism in northern cities coincided with the Great Migration and with World War I. Garveyism gave migrants a sense of belonging in their new northern homes. It was based around the Jamaican-born leader Marcus Garvey. In 1914, Marcus Garvey established the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA. This organization emphasized black nationalism, pride, and self-reliance. Garvey started the UNIA in his home country of Jamaica. In 1916, he relocated headquarters to Harlem, New York, and this move helped the UNIA membership to explode. And by 1921, the organization had about 4 million members. And many of these members included working-class black migrants, these people who are participating in the Great Migration. The UNIA espoused Pan-Africanism, encouraging blacks to embrace their African heritage and support people of African descent around the world. This is a notable perspective. For African Americans in this period, their heritage, their physical appearance, their origins on the continent are looked down upon by the larger American society. They're told that Africa has no history, black skin is ugly, black hair is ugly. And here comes the UNIA saying that no, everything about you is beautiful. Your heritage is beautiful. Where you come from is beautiful. Not only that, but that you should look to your brothers and sisters of African descent around the world. Support them. Be a source of comfort and assistance for them. So really trying to create a sense of unity across the African diaspora. Garvey used rituals, symbols, and uniforms, like those in the picture above, to imbue members with a sense of pride. Keep in mind that during this period, you still have African Americans being mocked and ridiculed in minstrel shows. But here is Garvey giving them uniforms and titles and official positions, and this helps to raise the esteem of black people. Garvey pushed for black economic self-sufficiency as well. Booker T. Washington was someone who he really admired. And like Washington, he believed that it was economic development that would lead to racial advancement. And towards that end, he established numerous businesses and also a newspaper, the Negro World. Garvey opened the Black Star Line in 1919. The purpose of this steamship company was to unite blacks throughout the world, enabling them to travel relatively easily throughout the diaspora. In 1923, Garvey was convicted for mail fraud related to his dealings with the Black Star Line. He was imprisoned for 2 years and later deported, and the UNIA faded soon thereafter. And so the Garvey movement waned by the end of the 1920s. Little did everyone know that a catastrophe was on the horizon. The stock market crashed in October 1929, and the United States was thrown into the Great Depression, which lasted from 1929 until about 1939. During this economic depression, black unemployment rates were higher than the national average. In 1932, for example, black unemployment in the South was 50%, and it was the same in Harlem, New York. President Herbert Hoover, who was the president at the time of the crash, did not adequately address the depression. And in 1932, Americans sought something new. They elected Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president. Roosevelt believed that a robust federal response was needed, and he enacted the New Deal to support unemployed Americans and pull the nation out of the Depression. The New Deal created a series of government agencies and programs, the purpose, again, being to get Americans back to work and get the economy going. And you can see the list here of just some of the New Deal programs. The New Deal proceeded in 2 phases. The first New Deal, from 1933 to 1934, and the second, more ambitious New Deal, 1935 to 1936. As a part of the second New Deal, you saw the creation of the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. WPA employees had a variety of jobs. One of them was to travel throughout the South, conducting interviews with former slaves about their experiences. By the 1930s, when these interviews are going on, you are seeing really the last generation of black people who had been enslaved dying out. And so thankfully, the WPA employees were able to preserve their stories. These WPA slave narratives preserved an essential component of African American history. Here is one example of a slave narrative taken down by the WPA. Here you see Henry Clay Mormon, who was born in slavery in Kentucky, and he's relating his story to this interviewer. And even today, you can read all of these slave narratives, and they will give you a first-hand account of what this experience was like. Writers like Zora Neale Hurston, Richard Wright, and Ralph Ellison also benefited from WPA programs. Hurston, for example, collected black folklore for the WPA, again preserving an important component of our history. Because of the New Deal, African Americans began to view the federal government in a different light. Not since Reconstruction had the federal government so directly acted for their benefit. They credited the Democratic Party with this development. They appreciated the New Deal. They appreciated the ability to become employed during the Depression. And they credited the Democratic Party, Roosevelt's party, with that. As a result, African Americans during this period began to abandon the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the party of Reconstruction, and instead they began to favor the Democratic Party. Adolf Hitler of Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. This action pulled European nations into a full-scale conflict that we now call World War II. This war lasted from 1939 until 1945. It included the Axis powers of Italy, Germany, and Japan, and the Allied powers of the United States, Great Britain, France, and the USSR. Just as we saw in World War I, in World War II, the United States was not immediately involved. That all changed on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Doris "Dory" Miller received a Navy Cross for his extraordinary courage during the bombing. He was the first African American to receive this honor. After the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States officially entered World War II. Some African Americans hesitated to support the war effort. The memories of World War I were still pretty fresh. They remembered the way they were treated during the war, having to serve in segregated units, having inferior combat training, and they remembered how they were treated afterwards. They remembered Red Summer. They also lamented that despite all of their service in World War I, the military remained segregated. The Pittsburgh Courier, which was an influential black newspaper, initiated the Double V campaign. It called for victory at home and victory abroad. Blacks supported this Double V campaign because it gave them a way to feel patriotic, to support the nation, but also make clear that they still expected to have recompense for their domestic struggles. In 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier said, "We, as colored Americans, are determined to protect our country, our form of government, and the freedoms which we cherish for ourselves and the rest of the world. Therefore, we have adopted the Double V war cry, victory over our enemies at home and victory over our enemies on the battlefield abroad. We have a stake in this fight. We are Americans too." Just as they had in World War I, blacks faced discrimination in the military in World War II. The military routinely underutilized black men and women, often giving them positions for which they were far overqualified. Black officers, for example, were not even allowed to outrank white officers in the same unit. Skilled black women, women who had trained for certain positions, were relegated to do menial tasks, doing laundry, preparing food. While they trained in the South, black soldiers faced violence and harassment. Some were even lynched. Ironically, the writer James Baldwin said that black families experienced, quote, "a peculiar kind of relief when they knew that their boys were being shipped out of the South to do battle overseas," end quote. So here he's saying that the situation in the South is so bad that we would rather send our children over to Germany. We'd rather send our children over to France to fight than deal with the malignant, insidious racism of the American South. Despite their treatment, black soldiers served with honor and valor, just as they had in every previous war in this nation's history. World War II reinforced the Great Migration. During the war, more than 1.5 million blacks left the South and moved north. Another aspect of the Great Migration was not only the move from the South to the North, but within the South, the move from rural areas to urban areas. These migrants, both in the North and in southern cities, took advantage of the newly available war industry jobs. So again, very similar to what happened in World War I. By the war's end, blacks made up over 8% of the nation's defense industry workers. And here you can see a hardworking black woman taking part in this defense industry. Although blacks in the North had greater employment opportunities, they still faced discrimination. discrimination in the workplace. Their mobility was limited. Yes, you can, work this job, but we'll never promote you to supervisor. We certainly won't promote you above white people. So in order to protect themselves and secure whatever rights they could, Black people joined labor unions. Competition between Blacks and whites for employment sometimes led to violent conflicts. So African Americans are not only contending with discrimination in the workplace, they're contending with racial violence because they have jobs in the North. World War II finally ended in 1945, and the Allies were victorious. Black people played an integral role in the war effort, not only on the battlefield, but in wartime industries at home. So having done this service, Blacks now push President Harry S. Truman for better treatment. They said, look, we fought in World War I. We fought in World War II. We demand to be treated as equals in this country. In 1946, Truman formed the President's Committee on Civil Rights to investigate the needs of the Black community. Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander was among those appointed to this committee. She was an attorney, and she was also Bishop Tanner's granddaughter. She later served as the lawyer for the AME Council of Bishops. In December 1947, the committee submitted its final report with a list of recommendations for what was necessary to assist the Black community. This report was called To Secure These Rights. Truman listened to the recommendations of his committee, and in 1948, he issued Executive Order 9981. This order took several years to fully implement, but it declared at long last an end to segregation in the military.